especialmente aos membros do grupo de pesquisa Capital e Periferia, e muito especialmente ao Matheus e à Nádia, né? E também, claro, ao Valmor e à sua equipe. Né? O Valmor é que segura todas as pontas e faz tudo funcionar, né, de maneira suave, né, e eficiente. Né? Eu queria, então, convidar o professor Alan Mabin para se juntar a nós e convidar a professora Sandra Pantaleão, da PUC de Goiás, para apresentar o professor e nos auxiliar aqui na mediação.
Boa tarde a todos. Bom, então vou fazer a apresentação do professor Alan Mabin. Ele é professor emérito de urbanismo da Escola de Arquitetura e Planejamento da Universidade de Wits, em Johannesburg. Ele possui doutorado pela Simon Fraser University do Canadá e mestrado pela Wits, sendo membro da South American Planning Institute. Com mais de 40 anos de experiência, ele esteve envolvido em diversos aspectos do desenvolvimento urbano na África do Sul, particularmente em Joanesburgo. Além disso, contribuiu para o estabelecimento da Planac em 1985, uma ONG que trabalha com comunidades para fazer as cidades trabalharem para as pessoas. Alan Mabin colabora de perto com o Observatório Regional da Cidade de Gauteng e com colegas no Brasil, França e outros países. Sua palestra apresentará análises contidas no artigo de mesmo nome, escrito em coautoria com Philip Harrison e publicado em 2023 na revista Progress in Planning. Convido todos a acessarem o site www.alanmabin.org para conferir uma lista de suas publicações recentes. Seja muito bem-vindo e boa palestra.
Muito obrigado. Boa tarde, todas e todos. E muito obrigado para a invitação por esta palestra da tarde hoje. Most of the time, I will speak in my own language. Desculpe-me. As we proceed, hopefully, you will see that for those for whom English is a challenge, and English is a challenge for me too, hopefully we will be able to understand each other. So thank you very much for being here and for the invitation. I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. So there are 7 points here. And I'm not going to read them because everybody here can read those points. And I hope my tradução, I hope my translation is okay. You can score me out of 50 points later, not 100, because I'm definitely not 100. So I will start by talking about urbanização extensiva, or extended urbanization, as a conceptual point of departure. And then I will proceed to approach the work that I have conducted with my colleague, as you colleagues have already said, Professor Philip Harrison. And I'm sorry he's not here, but there you go. So, a starting point is the work of the very well-known sociologist, Henri Lefebvre, that person who was at the university, used to be called Université de Paris Nanterre, Paris 10, nowadays called Université de Paris-Nanterre La Défense. And in 1968, Henri Lefebvre played a key role in the origins of what I could call the Paris Spring, the student movements and revolt in Paris in May 1968. And that's when he first came to global attention. Here I have retranslated into Portuguese from the English translation of his work in French, so I apologize for that. If I suddenly start to speak French instead of Portuguese, please forgive me, because I'm definitely better in Frances than I am in Portuguese. So I leave you to read those few words. It's a foundational point of departure for many contemporary urban scholars, in particular for people such as Christian Schmidt in Zurich, in Switzerland, and Neil Brenner, now at Harvard, who have gone much further than Lefebvre in talking about planetary urbanization. They don't like the word the city anymore. They want to talk about the planet as an urbanized space in which city forms of life, as many of us would say, affect everyone. Nobody, with very rare exceptions, is exempted. And so here is the English translation of Lefebvre's the same words, the urban fabric, tecido urbano. And I think it's quite powerful, but it needs a lot of further development. And one of the people who has provided such development, and here I quote from his own English version of his work, is Roberto Montemor of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais in Belo Horizonte. And I don't always agree with his work, but it is certainly profound and provocative. And he, I think, uses, for Phil and myself, my colleague Phil Harrison and myself, he's a little more modest in his conceptualization of what is happening in the world. He doesn't talk about planetary urbanization. He talks about extended urbanization, which I think is a more useful idea, so that we are in a process in which city life is in the process of affecting everybody's lives increasingly. And that is for our work on capital city regions. That is a point of departure. And I think here I would agree with Professor Montemor and say extended urbanization is the dominant socio-spatial form of contemporary capitalism. And not a lot of people are completely exempt from that. So, and here is a translation of those words again back into Portuguese. I apologize for doing it that way around. In other words, urbanização extensiva assume diversas formas. It's not always exactly the same. It's not necessarily the same in my country, South Africa, as it is in Amazonas, where Montemor did a lot of his original work in this field. So it's diverse. We don't try to collapse everything into sameness. And then outside this, what Montemor in the English version calls socio-spatial forms of contemporary capitalism, we need also to move away from the disciplines that many of us are in. Arquitetura, urbanismo, geografia, the spatial kinds of disciplines. We need to remember the powers also of anthropology, sociology, of such approaches to the world. And for me, the most influential sociologist working, and here we begin to approach Cidades, capitais, and the city regions of capitals, the most influential scholar to me is Johan Thurborn, whose work some of you will definitely know. He's only published, I think, 36 books. It's not much. And translated into languages around the world, including Japanese and so on. He has become, I'm very fortunate to claim, a friend of mine. And in producing this book, Cities of Power, I'm not sure to what extent it's now yet been translated, but in producing the book Cities of Power, he did not visit every one of the roughly 200 national capital cities in the world. He only visited about 80 of them over a period of about 10 years. And as this little text says, he visited places from classic, well-known, well-written, well-researched capitals like Washington, D.C., and, of course, Paris, Kazakhstan, Astana in Kazakhstan, all sorts of other places, including Pretoria, where I happened to spend some time with him, and Brasilia, of course. So, rethinking urban future in terms of the city region in the context of extended urbanization, that's, in broad terms, what informs the work that Phil and I have performed on capital cities. So, capital cities, capital city regions in extended urbanization. Let's look across different continents. I know in the publicity for this talk, Maria Fernanda, thank you very much, correctly used the term of the cities of the south. But in fact, we also wanted to include the north because we want to cross over, in a sense, the artificial division between south and north of the world. And that's why Paris is one of our cities, so that we don't leave behind everything else, although most of our cities, in a sense, are in the south. So we wanted to look across continents. We wanted to look at the capital region, the capital city region question, not just the core, if you like, in the case of Brasilia, not just the Arche Monumental, but the whole thing. In the case of Brasilia, not only the Distrito Federal, but the region that goes beyond that. That's why we were touching on places beyond Aguas Claras, outside the Distrito Federal, which form part of this expanding city region. And that's the approach we take wherever we go around the world. And so what is happening in the contemporary capital city region around the world? So let us just divert for a moment. One of the things that's happening is that everywhere around the world, there continues to be a conversation, as there was in Brazil for 150 years, let's have a new capital city. Let's give up on Salvador, or let's give up on Rio, let's do something else. And one of the classic cases at the moment, where a new capital city in a completely different geographical location is under development, is in the massive country of Indonesia, with its thousands of islands, some bigger, some much smaller. Not just Bali, for those of you who wish to go surfing in Bali, which is worth doing. And so in Indonesia, a new capital is being built on the island of Borneo, as we call it in English, not in Bahasa Indonesia, Nusantara. New capital is really what that name means. Instead of Jakarta, on the very crowded island of that Jakarta is situated on, with half the population of Indonesia. And here you see from the top left-hand corner, the traffic jams and the crowding of Jakarta on the island of Java, to the open space you see on the top right of the picture, where the president of Indonesia is being shown the site of the new capital before the building commenced. And you see in the bottom right-hand corner some of the early building of the new capital. And that president, Joko Widodo of Indonesia, of course, wanted to learn from other countries which had relocated their capitals. So I don't need to tell you very much about who is in this picture. So I'm not going to spend time on that. It's the opportunity to learn from other processes. If we move to my continent, and you may think that as a Branco, how could Africa be my continent? Well, hello. So, if we go to post-colonial Africa, if we go to Mali, a French colonial territory separated from the whole of French West Africa as it was in colonial times, it had to have a new capital, if indeed a country must have a capital city. And that's why Bamako exists as the capital of very disputed Mali. In the case of Malawi, in southern Africa, the colonial capital of Blantyre was considered by the post-colonial regime not appropriate. And so a new capital was built, Lilongwe. There's a literature about Lilongwe. And that is controversial for all sorts of reasons. Like Botswana, which had no capital, like Mali had no capital. So a new capital had to be built, apparently, which is Gaborone, which, if you translate from Setswana, means place of the people. That could be a contradiction. Go to Dar es Salaam on the coast of Tanzania. Most people probably think Dar es Salaam is the capital of Tanzania. Strictly speaking, it's not. Because in 200 kilometers away in the interior is the new city of Dodoma, which is officially the capital of Tanzania. Nigeria is the biggest example. And at the late 20th century, the building of Abuja was the biggest new capital city project. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And in the parentheses I put here, I suggest there is incredible opportunity for comparative study for graduate students who are looking for subjects. Here is opportunity. And of course, Brazil, as Professor Trevisan has brought to our attention, there are many new capitals. It's not only the new capital of the country Brasilia, it's also Goiânia, it's Palmas, or in the 1890s, it's Belo Horizonte. So Brazil is a fascinating case. And given that in the African continent there are so many new capitals, including now in Egypt, there are some interesting questions to be posed. So let us look briefly at Nigeria, as we call it in English. And the capital of Nigeria, do we have an arrow here? Yes, can we see that? No, but there is Lagos, down in the corner, which was the capital of independent Nigeria at the end of British colonialism in 1963. And for many years, the idea, a bit like Brasilia, the idea existed that a new site for a new capital should be found. And eventually, from the end of the 1970s through the 1980s, in radical changes in Nigerian federal government, eventually Abuja was developed and exists today. And there's one particularly interesting thing about Abuja, which is a city like Brasilia, where one can celebrate radical forms of architecture and planning in the construction of the city. But the majority of the people do not live in the planned part of the capital city. They don't live in the green area on this map. They live in the other areas that are shaded in that other color. So I leave it at that. The last thing I want to do is to criticize history. But a problem with the global literature on capital cities is that they are focused on two things which are a problem. In a world of extended urbanization, to focus on the Asche Monumental, or the core government function area of a city, does not help us to understand what is going on, let alone what may happen in the future. And so while the history is of enormous importance, and a group like Capitale Periferia is doing really important work on excavating histories that are lost, in a sense, about particularly Brasilia, this is crucially important. But we need also to go further than that. And we need to get out of the core. And as that name, Capitale Periferia, says, we need to get into the whole city region. So our broad argument, myself and my colleague Philip, our broad argument is exactly along those lines. I'm not going to dwell on that. Here is a little, my bad Portuguese translation, so that now we still have this problem of not enough concentration in capital city research on the scale of the city region, on the meaning of the continuously expanding scale of the city region, what this means now and particularly for the future. So moving towards the research that we've done, we chose to work on 5 capital city regions on 4 different continents, as you already know. And let me tell you that we faced limitations in doing this research. You know, in your thesis, you must always have the weaknesses of your research in your conclusions and what other people should do to go beyond those weaknesses. Well, one of our weaknesses is that neither of us speaks Mandarin or other Chinese languages. So to be writing about Beijing and its enormous region, which you can sometimes think of as having 120 million people, to do that without the language, this is a problem. But Phil lived in Beijing for a year, and it so happens his partner comes from Shanghai and speaks Mandarin, so that was probably helpful. We have spent time in Delhi, and while we don't speak Hindi or Tamil or the other predominant Indian languages, because of the history of British colonialism, many, many people, especially officials and others in India, speak perfectly good English, better than mine most of the time. And so that wasn't so much of a limit. Portuguese in Brasilia, as certain professors here well know, this can be a challenge for me. But I think we've managed, with the help of colleagues like Maria Fernanda and others like Elani who are here. In the case of Paris, I do speak French, so I'll be arrogant enough to claim that I could manage in Paris. That's probably very arrogant. And in one of the capitals of South Africa, Pretoria, I speak at least some of the languages that are spoken in Pretoria. But that's a very important question when we move into comparative study, of course. So what did we do? I would say we did 3 things, which are set out briefly here. Examinar as capitais nas suas diversas escalas. Contemplar as visões atuais. What are the contemporary visions of the future? And how are they contested? Especially in the electoral democracies in our study. And 4 of the countries in our study are electoral democracies. In one of them, a week-long national election is taking place right now, which is India. And I'm not going to tell you about Brazil. And in South Africa, there is a national election on the 29th of this month, in which I am not able to vote because I will be in Brazil. So there you are. If you want to know why I can't vote, I'll explain. And in this presentation, we set out 5 paths, 5 caminhos, I translate into Portuguese, Oops. And so here are these 5 paths of present-day capital city planning, which build on the history, of course, of these capital city regions. And here they are in, again, my hopefully not too bad translation into Portuguese. So I leave those to you. So path number 1, like the history of Brasilia, let's move to a completely new capital city site. Then what happens as the enormous scale of a city region builds up? Or we might try to do something with the functions of the capital. What do we do with the functions of the capital? Do we relocate just the functions of the capital, or do we try to relocate business, commercial, capitalist activities out of the city, which is more the approach in Beijing? And just to go through this quite quickly, another approach is to replan the core of the city. It's as though in Brasilia, a government came along that wanted to entirely redo the Arte Monumental. It's not impossible. I admit it's unlikely. But that is what is taking place in Delhi, in the capital city core area of New Delhi. We'll look at that in a moment. And to some extent, there's an attempt to do that in Pretoria in South Africa. Or some other form of decentralization. So very briefly, those are different ways of thinking about it. Now, these 5 capital city regions that we've explored are pretty different from each other in a lot of ways. What they have in common is they are all different scales but fairly large capital city regions. The largest and the fastest growing now is Delhi. That's the green line. It has overtaken Beijing, just as India has overtaken the People's Republic of China in population size. Paris, which was the biggest of these quite a long time ago, is not growing particularly fast. Its region, around 12 million people, is relatively stable. And of course, if we were to look at the division of labor and the nature of wealth, we would find that Paris was far and away, on average, the richest of these 5 city regions. But that does not mean that everybody in the Paris region is themselves wealthy, because there is an enormous inequality within that society. And that, of course, is true across all of these. And Brasilia and Pretoria are significantly smaller. They're on a different scale, if you like. Even though Brasilia remains a very fast, I hardly have to tell you, a very fast-growing city, especially in the Brazilian context. And Pretoria probably slowed down, but it's also growing. So very quickly, I don't want to take the whole of your afternoon, especialmente em inglês. At some point, we return, retorno, such a wonderful Brazilian concept. We return to Portuguese. But if we go to Delhi, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you see a number of different boundaries. And you will see in 5 maps of these 5 city regions the same kind of, if you like, confusion of boundaries. We can have an enormous idea of a national capital region. You see the line with little dots enclosing an enormous area, hundreds of kilometers across, around Delhi. And that's where we get to the population, which is really gigantic by just about any standards. And yet, we cross the lines of the states. India is a federal country, a little bit like Brazil. The states have roughly similar powers to Estados no Brasil. unlike South Africa, for example, or France, where there may be regions in France, les régions, or the provinces as we have in South Africa, they are not federal countries, but they do have units that have elected governments and so on. So how does that relate? So Delhi, the region of Delhi crosses over these state boundaries, just as the region of Brasilia crosses over the line of the Distrito Federal. So I'll leave that for a moment. And then on this side, you see Prime Minister Modi's new plan for the core of New Delhi, the key area of government functions. Now, anybody who has studied anything about the history of New Delhi will know that this new capital for India, when the capital was moved from the city we now call Calcutta, Kolkata, when it was moved from there to Delhi in the 1920s, India was a colonial territory. It was part of the British Empire. So the creation of New Delhi as a new capital for India, next to Old Delhi, which is a very, very old city. That's why we're starting here with Delhi, because it's the oldest of these 5 capital city regions by centuries. A new capital, but built for a colonial government at a time when the British Raj, when the British Empire thought that the British Empire would last forever. It's not only Adolf Hitler who talked about 1,000 years. So there you are. And yet, if we take the concept of extended urbanization and we explore India, we will find that even in the villages, in the thousands and thousands of villages, where more than half the population of India still lives today, the impact of contemporary capitalist urbanism is profound. And that's the core meaning of the notion of extended urbanization. So how does that economic, social, anthropological, political concept relate to the space of the national capital territory? So within this complexity, and you'll see a table like this for each of the 5 capitals, I will not dwell on these in this presentation because there's far too much detail there. It's simply to set out that we can think of the capital at these different scales, sometimes with official boundaries around them and official authorities that may have certain governmental and planning powers, certain powers of urbanism, if you like. It varies from place to place, but all of these 5 cities have that kind of complexity. And we may also have an understanding of a capital city region that is not matched by an agency that has planning powers at all. So what does this mean for our future? So I won't go on that subject, and I'll quickly pass through these so we can look at Delhi in all sorts of different ways. What do we think is the capital of India? Is it New Delhi? Is it the whole national capital region? Is it something bigger than that? How do we conceptualize what the seat of power is in Indian governmental terms? So, of course, we've tried to extract themes from each of our cases, and here we have some of the themes that emerge in Delhi. And the last point on this slide suggests that even in India, a conversation goes on about maybe we should abandon Delhi as the capital altogether and do the same thing as Indonesia is doing at the moment. So if we turn to Beijing, and I won't spend a lot of time here, I have visited Beijing, but I don't know it particularly well. And we have the same kind of mapping, which doesn't impose an idea, but it shows the red square right in the middle is indeed the red square of Delhi. It is Tiananmen Square, and you know why Tiananmen Square is infamous in the world for a lot of reasons, but also famous in the world, because that's where the Congress of the People sits. Across the road from Tiananmen Square is the Heavenly Palace, the real headquarters of power in the People's Republic of China, and for that matter, the mausoleum of Chairman Mao. So it's a key core area right in, if you like, the middle of this thing. But is that the capital? Or is the capital to be conceptualized at the scale of the whole region? How does that relate to the nature of urbanization, of urbanism that is unfolding in China today? And I don't have to tell anybody here that China is a country which has changed incredibly, even in the last few years, let alone in the last few decades. So we can do the same thing in Beijing. We can scale what is the national capital in all sorts of different ways and pose again the question, what do we mean? What is the national capital of China? And what is happening in the future? What are the visions for the future of the national capital of China? By the way, these tables, if you get hold of this article, which Maria Fernanda pointed to, or was it you, Sandra? I can't remember. It was one of the two of you mentioned this article we've published. I'll show you the title page of it later on. And although it's in a journal that you might not have access to directly, guess what? We'll share the proof copy with you. So there you are. Shh. Don't tell Francis and Taylor or whatever it is. So those tables are in that article. And of course, the People's Republic of China is led by a secretary of the Communist Party, president of China, who's already been there for quite some time, may be the most powerful individual in the world today. He may leave Joe Biden far behind, whatever happens in the future of the presidency in the United States of America. And so they really do talk in terms of 1,000 years of the future of the People's Republic of China. And one of the things that's going on in Beijing is what they translate into English as decanting, pouring out non-national government functions, especially decentralization of profit-making businesses, into satellite cities, if you want to think of it that way. So very briefly, let me refer to Paris. And again, we have the same complexity in spatial, in geographical terms. We have the boundary of the Île-de-France, the Région Île-de-France, which is that kind of brownish, pinkish, reddish, brownish line. Within that, we now have, for the last 8 years, we have the Métropole du Grand Paris. So you will find that the Président des Régions, who's currently a woman called Valérie Pécresse, who comes from the conservative side of French politics. She thinks that the Île-de-France, I've heard her say this in opening an exhibition in Paris, she thinks that the Île-de-France is the natural scale of government for the national capital of France. Other people don't think that. So that the mayor of Paris, who happens to be another woman, and who will be running for re-election soon, her view is that the national capital is the city of Paris. But she comes from the Parti Socialiste, and it's true that the Parti Socialiste has also kind of changed its view on the nature of the city of Paris in relation to the surrounding banlieue, the surrounding suburbios, the surrounding suburbs. None of these words means exactly, as you well know, the same thing as any of the others. But one of the things that's definitely going on is that the relationship between the city of Paris, which here, and you make out just that gray sort of tone in this schematic diagram, that's the little city of Paris with its population of not much more than 2 million people. Whereas the region has a population of about 12 million, and if the extended urban region goes beyond that boundary, maybe it's 15 or 18 million people, and nobody can exactly say. But so the point about this is that these new, many of you will know this, the Grand Paris Express, the new railway system that is being built to integrate with existing railway systems, including the Paris Metro. That new system, at a cost of about 40 billion euros, which is not cheap in my personal estimation, this is designed to change the relationship physically between the city of Paris and what is around it. And interestingly enough, of course, that project came not from the left wing, it came from the right wing, because it ultimately began with the President Sarkozy when he was in power in France. It's more complicated than that, but that will do. So there's real change taking place, and once again, there's a fluidity. There's a sense of change. There's a sense of dynamism in the way in which the relationships between these different scales is moving along. And I suppose when we come to Brasilia, we might want to be able to say the same kind of thing. What's important here is that the concept of what is Paris has definitely moved along. It's perfectly true that a lot of intellectuals who work at the Sorbonne or other institutions in Paris still think that anything outside the walls, anything extramuros, is something almost foreign. But that's not the way most people think about the city today. And that's a significant change in the history of France. So what is the national capital? The question again, it may have slowed down in its change in population terms, but there are many other rapid changes taking place. And yet this is set in an uncertain world. And that's a theme which is particularly obvious at a city like Paris. In Beijing, it may look to leading figures in the Communist Party, at least in their public statements, that the future is assured. It is certain. Whereas in Paris, the future is absolutely in doubt. It's uncertain. And that's partly about Europe. It's partly about all sorts of other significant features. Now, South Africa is a strange country in all sorts of ways. It is the only country in the world, although there's some close parallels next door in the history of Zimbabwe and some little parallels even in Kenya. One could make comparisons with Algeria under French colonial rule, but it's the only country in the world that for 40 years had a policy of apartheid, which sought to segregate people through something of irrelevant character in all sorts of human terms. But it's not the only unusual thing about South Africa. And officially, apartheid, of course, came to an end in 1994, 30 years ago, almost to the day, because Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president on the 10th of May, 1994, just past 30 years ago. I was there with my kids, just in case you want to know. So, in a way, what is unusual is that South Africa, if you go to Wikipedia, and I'm not suggesting you must go to Wikipedia, your professors would be very shocked if you are students and I was telling you to go to Wikipedia. And if you go to Wikipedia, it will tell you South Africa has 3 capital cities. It has where the legislature, the parliament sits, which is the city where I live, which is Cape Town. It has the judicial capital, which they will tell you is Bloemfontein, or Mangaung, the place of the leopard, as we call it today. Or it's Pretoria, within the city of Tshwane, a bigger concept than the old city of Pretoria itself, where most of the public servants, most of the public sector is located in Pretoria. And the president's office, the main president's office, is in the Union Buildings, which is an iconic structure which has not been abandoned post-apartheid. And that's even controversial in its own right. But it is where Nelson Mandela was inaugurated. On the other hand, there's a 4th capital, because the new Superior Court in South Africa, which is the Constitutional Court, is not in Bloemfontein, it's in Johannesburg. So in a sense, Johannesburg is a 4th national capital city. Johannesburg is also the capital of the province of Gauteng, which is the Sesotho word for place of gold. Well, it used to be a place of gold for some. In the province of Gauteng. And we now conceptualize, in a sense, Johannesburg as not only in a sense a financial capital of the country, but also as a national capital city because of the Constitutional Court. So it's a bit confusing, but Pretoria remains the fundamental national capital. The Brazilian embassy has a branch in Cape Town, but the main Brazilian embassy is in Pretoria. It's actually moved to the suburbs, but that's another story. And equally, as I've already said, most of the public sector is located there. And this is in the context, South Africa is about 1/5 of the size of Brazil, and it has a population of about 60-some million people, which is a lot less than the population of Brazil. It's easily the smallest of the countries we're talking about here. And just to give you a sort of rough sketch, of course it has a very uneven distribution of population, but there are parts of the country where we would definitely want to say, well, what does extended urbanization mean? We may have these concentrations of population in the major city regions of the country. You can see those on this map. But nevertheless, we can still think about Pretoria in terms of its different scales. We can apply the same kind of thinking that we have in the other three so far. Extended urbanization may mean something a little bit special in South Africa, which probably is in common with many other countries, from Mexico to Nigeria. But the amount of migration daily, weekly, monthly, through the year, between places that are sometimes called rural, but are nevertheless deeply influenced by what is taking place in the cities. And that migration, circular or otherwise, between these different areas means that the entire country is deeply affected by the contemporary circumstances of urbanization, even in a country like South Africa, which you could, to some extent, parallel with Mexico, where there is ejido land, which has different status from all sorts of other areas of land and goes back to the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. It's not the same as traditional authority land in South Africa, where we continue to have chiefly systems of authority alongside democratically elected systems of government. So that's a complexity which doesn't necessarily affect every country. And yet, of course, the boundary of South Africa is a purely colonial accident from more than 100 years ago. And at the scale of Brazil, the whole of southern Africa, with a similar population to the population of Brazil, similar geographical area, similar population to Brazil, is actually in many respects a very integrated environment. And we could think of urbanization across the whole area. Now, what does that mean about state power and the concentration of state power in capital city regions like that of Pretoria? Of course, over many years, there have been proposals to replan in Pretoria. I will skip that. It remains controversial. Up here you have a well-known South African author, Mandalanga, writing about how the inauguration of Nelson Mandela at the Union Buildings was a travesty, and these old symbols of the previous regime should be removed, just like Mr. Modi as Prime Minister of India wanting to overcome the colonial meaning of New Delhi. And that, of course, leads people to say, no, we must change this capital city system in South Africa. At one level, the official approaches are to reorganize the core area of Pretoria where the capital functions are located. Whether that is really happening or not is a different question, unlike New Delhi. And then lots of South African political figures think Cape Town should be abandoned as a capital city. Parliament should move to Pretoria, or a whole new capital should be created, just like Nigeria, or, oh yes, Brazil. So that blue star here on this map is the demographic center of South Africa. And Parliament sits over here in Cape Town. Now that's supposed to be where the people are represented. So that's a little strange. Therefore, people think maybe somewhere in this region is where we should have a new capital city. That idea has not really yet taken off. So we can talk about the same sorts of themes, the complexities of the capital city region. We need a concept of extended urbanization. There are profound weaknesses in planning, and there are massive uncertainties about the future of the capital city region, as there are in many other places, but particularly in South Africa. So moving towards concluding, I've definitely used enough of your valuable time this afternoon. Moving towards concluding, I'm not going to tell you about Brasilia, because you are going to tell me about Brasilia. And all I'm going to say is what is interesting about Brasilia is that we can see some of the same kinds of features in the case of Brasilia. The existence of these different scales, once again. The question of the core, the question of where the core government functions are located. And most of you will recognize this image over here, where the government of the Distrito Federal is supposed to relocate into Taguatinga, which is not quite the same as the history. So, what have we learned from our study? Here are a few points, 5 little points about what we feel, myself and my colleague Phil feel, that we have learned. We have to move on from the preoccupation, not to abandon history. We should say that here, so I apologize to all the historians, architectural and planning historians in the room. We should say we don't mean to abandon history. There's much to do. But we need to move on to the contemporary situation in planning. And I won't go on through these points because they're all pretty straightforward. They don't require a great deal of elaboration. And the last point, we have found it very useful to think in terms of extended urbanization, urbanização extensiva or ampliada, as a useful way of beginning to think about where we are. And there is the same text, more or less, in English. So to summarize, this presentation argues that by catching up conceptually to trends in capital city studies, urban scholarship can really be advanced. It can make a great leap in new directions. I've already stressed there are really significant opportunities here for new work. And in that work, perhaps we achieve greater transparency of the mysteries of political power in the societies in which we find ourselves living. I told you I would show you the title page of the published version of what we have done, which does not include a conceptual account of extended urbanization. That's the next thing to come. And it is possible to obtain a copy of that article. All you have to do is ask. And last, I have many people to thank. Here is a list of names. We would not have been able to do this work. And that's one of the things that makes it so valuable to me, because of the huge number of people with whom we have met, discussed, interviewed, learnt from, some of them sitting in this room, particularly with reference to Brasilia, but also with reference to the wider world. And in particular, one of the people who's been especially important in provoking this kind of work is there, Maria Fernanda. And for that reason, since I like a little performance, I brought along a little bag, 2 bags, and I have to open the first one, and then I have to open the second one. And when I open the second one, you will see that I come from the wine-producing region of South Africa. It's not cold, so she's not going to open it this afternoon. So may I express my thanks, agradecimento. Muito obrigado, todas e todos, for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, so much for the wonderful presentation. E antes da gente abrir, então...
I'm sorry, there's only one.
Before we start making toasts, I'd like to, Sandra Pantaleão from PUC Goiás, kindly agreed to kind of comment and make, fazer uma mediação. Queria já começar pedindo para vocês, para com muita liberdade, obrigada, para com muita liberdade comentarem o que veio à cabeça de vocês. Eu acho que tem muitas pessoas aqui que têm muitos trabalhos que, de uma forma ou de outra, tocam em questões que foram aqui tratadas. Então, obrigada.
Bom, então, né, eu vou falar em português mesmo. Aqueles que quiserem fazer alguma colocação, né, em relação à apresentação, de uma certa maneira, my thesis is about it, but I study Pearl River Delta in China. I remember of this, and this your study is very important because planning about the new challenges, and more than important now, it's think about it, okay?
Em português também, não é? Lentamente, mas em português.
Então, acho que a gente pensar um pouco, né, talvez essa relação, que não é só a história urbana, porque sempre que você busca sobre Brasília, é a sua história, né? E o que vem após a história de Brasília. Então, acho que essa é uma questão importante. E quando você faz essa comparação com as outras cidades, como que isso também, né, vai mostrando, principalmente, essa relação das escalas, né, que também é trabalhada pelo Soja, né, Eduardo o Soja, em termos de pensar essa ocupação dispersa do território, o que isso está implicado, principalmente com as relações de poder, né, the power relation. Okay. Acho que é isso, né? E quem quiser completar, acho que pode ficar à vontade para fazer as perguntas.
Tá. Tá bom. When needed.
Elaine, quem mais?
Por favor.
Os estudos que você tem feito nessas 5 enormes cidades-regiões, a gente que agora está vivendo uma grande tragédia no Rio Grande do Sul, eu gostaria de perguntar sobre essa questão da urbanização extensiva e as relações ambientais. Como essas cidades se preparam para esses desafios climáticos que a gente hoje em dia tem como uma principal preocupação, né? Não só em relação às cidades, mas também em relação a essas grandes extensões urbanizadas. Fui clara?
Tá.
Ótimo.
Obrigado.
Em português. Primeiro, é um prazer rever Alan. Uma alegria rever. E eu queria colocar uma pergunta, uma questão um pouco mais conceitual ligada ao problema das escalas que você tocou, a scala questions. Como é que a gente poderia, do seu ponto de vista, diferenciar os conceitos de cidade-região e cidade metropolitana aplicada a esses diferentes 5 casos que são aqui analisados comparativamente. E quero dizer também que eu acho muito interessante a apropriação que você faz do conceito de urbanização estendida, sobretudo a partir da visão do nosso colega Roberto Montemor e do Neil Brenner também, né, que são 2 pesquisadores que produzem muitos trabalhos, muitas investigações e muitas reflexões sobre a complexidade desse conceito planetário de urbanização estendida. E eu, particularmente, aplico mais o conceito metropolitano, faço mais o debate da questão metropolitana. E penso que há uma diferença escalar entre a noção de cidade-região e cidade metropolitana, não é? Por isso coloco essa questão, agradecendo muito a sua contribuição.
Continua? Faz
mais 2 ou mais, pode ser, acho que mais 1 ou mais 2, né? Mais uma, né? Eu queria fazer uma também, se possível.
So, first of all, thanks for the wonderful presentation. And my question is like, in my previous work, in my dissertation, I worked on this relation between demographic center and capital region. You know, this discussion between moving to the capital. And I'd like to know if there are any literature about regarding this discussion between the demographic center and national capitals. Thank you.
Hello. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you for the outstanding presentation. And actually, it's more like a curiosity. When you were talking about Paris, and you show us the line of public transportation that go through the banlieue. Actually, I speak French better than English, but let's go. And I was thinking about the extension of the city. If even more we extend the public transportation so the cities go wider and bigger, and I was thinking how was the consequences, like gentrification, for example, or because in Paris we have a good public transportation and a metro that works relatively well, and I was thinking how is the limit of this? So the transport goes wide and the city too, and ça va pousser les gens. So I was thinking about this.
Próxima vez em francês, não é?
She speaks perfect French.
On peut discuter un peu plus loin en français.
Oh, ouais, on peut discuter en français si vous voulez. Pour moi, ça sera un peu plus facile.
Você nome é?
Daniela.
Daniela. Obrigado. Okay,
Can I just add something to her?
No.
No. A big dynamics, a big theme here is, on one hand, we have this extended urbanization that tends to have no limits, no boundaries, and on the other hand, the difference between core and region. So it seems to me two conflictive dynamics. So I was wondering, in terms of these cases, are the authorities, the government planning, thinking in terms more of centralizing or decentralizing to to deal this kind of opposite dynamics for a defined core versus a periphery, and on the other hand, for this unlimited extension that also makes pressure on the core?
Okay. Shall I start?
Please.
Ça va. French is much easier for me than Portuguese, I'm sorry. But so I was telling the story earlier of how once I was speaking at USP Maranhão in São Paulo, and I asked the audience, would you prefer me to speak English or French? And people of my age, just a few, said, French. Everybody else said English. It's embarrassing because I grew up in an English-speaking household. And, even in South Africa, some of you know this well, English is the home language of about 8% of the population of South Africa. In the cities, just about everybody can communicate in English. Not in the whole country. So, it's a contradiction a little bit like the scale of the world and the dominance of this particular language. I don't know, maybe Mandarin is next. Some people think it is. Okay, so first thing I want to say, I'm going to try and respond generally to the points that you've raised rather than being absolutely, if that's okay with you. But I'll make some specific comments as I go through. First of all, as I said in the beginning, we must acknowledge the weaknesses in our own work. There is always room to improve. And there definitely is room to do better here. And I mentioned the work of Johan Thurborn earlier on, and you'll see, I think, how this relates to some of the points that have been raised. You will perhaps remember, some of you will know the book that I put the cover of on the screen. The national, the global. One of the words is the popular. The popular. What are the people doing? Quite apart from government, the planners, what are the people doing? What is the mobilization, the organization of the people? What are the politics? We don't say enough about that because even in Beijing, things can be contested. It's true that people have died as a result of contest, and that's true in many countries. But so this is a weakness, and it relates to some of the questions that have been raised. For example, Professor Schwarzberg, that one way of responding to the point that the points that you raised is to say, how do we understand what has changed in the world in recent decades? And what is it that's driving some of those changes? And to what extent is class struggle the motor of history, as a well-known philosopher once wrote in the 19th century? So we have not grappled sufficiently with those kinds of questions. And it relates to this question of scale and what we mean by phrases and words like city region, which is, a phrase which in a sense has come from Los Angeles. It's a particularly English language phrase, really, which when we say Cidades, we're really, in a sense, translating from English. And it's not necessarily a helpful way to express the same, which is part of my way of answering the point that you are raising. And you know yourself, sir, that you are in the acknowledgements in this paper. I have probably totally misrepresented in my work on Brasilia the valuable things you told me, so I apologize. But so what we mean by those questions, and we see in the expression of the scales of governmentality in the world today, we see disruption and contest going on certainly in these 5 capital cities, we see disruption and contest going on about what is this region. And take the Paris case, it's the clearest, it's the most obvious in some respects. It's partly related to the resources of French society, of course, which are not unlimited, but they're very substantial. Because, here we have the situation in Paris of the Région Île-de-France, which in terms of being an elected thing and only goes back to the 1980s, it's only 40 years old in a real sense. And yet within that there emerges this controversial need for some to have a métropole du Grand Paris. And so that's a practical illustration of the difference between a region and a metropole. How do these things relate? So I don't have an answer to the valuable points that you've raised, but so we could, again, on a weakness in our paper, please, your commentary is most welcome, all of you, but I don't think we've sufficiently problematized, to use your word, we haven't sufficiently problematized the question of scale. We say quite a lot about the question of scale. It comes back to something you said as well, Elani, but there's a long way to go in exactly that area. Elani also raised, and Sandra, that relates to, in many ways, to the point that you raised in opening, thank you, the discussion. Elani, you raised another area on which we don't have enough to say, which is the question, let's call it the environmental, the sustainability, the durability, the whichever other set of questions, the disasters which many people think confront us in a variety of ways. And as you say, the circumstances in Rio Grande do Sul are possibly an illustration of things that have actually changed. And you people in Brasilia have also experienced things which may not be as dramatic as Porto Alegre, but you didn't have to close the airport for weeks at a stretch, for example. So I haven't got much to say in that area, but it's an area that, again, there is enormous scope for further discussion. What is the consequence of the Chinese government's approach to this decanting of business functions into these satellite cities of Beijing? What are the impacts on the fragile environments? Anyone who's been to Beijing will know immediately that this is a fragile natural environment. Take a trip to the Great Wall of China and you pass through exactly those areas into which the Chinese government is in the process of trying to move profit-making activities. It's a very fragile environment. What are the consequences of change in that sense? So I don't have any more to say. It's, I'm afraid, weak and not very helpful. I thought you were going, Matthias, thank you, in a different direction when you started your remarks, because at first I thought, do we have a literature which evaluates the positives and negatives of the relocation of a capital city? I still know people in Rio de Janeiro who think that moving the capital to Brasilia was a terrible, expensive, costly, and damaging mistake, not just to Rio, but to Brazil, if not to Latin America and the world. So I don't mean they're right, but I mean, is there a literature which raises those questions? There certainly is in Nigeria, because of the difficulties of Abuja in the context of a very fast-growing country, the population of which will probably be larger than the population of Brazil fairly soon, incredibly enough. And so, what are the consequences of having relocated the national capital from Lagos to Abuja? I don't have an answer to that question. And you know that there are armed struggles going on in Nigeria as well. There are insurgents, apart from kidnapping hundreds of teenage girls at a time in the northeast of Nigeria. These events have impact in Abuja and elsewhere in Nigerian society as well. So that is part of the context within which these things are going on, which I did not particularly stress. I am working on a little project to write some comparative work about Abuja with a colleague who happens to come from Nigeria. So I don't know. So it wasn't just about positive and negative, though, but you also asked, you carried that on in different directions, and let's talk about that a little later, because I should shut up. But Daniela also, asked about the consequences. This is also about costs and negatives and positives, in a sense. I mean, the main thing I would say about Grand Paris Express, and I bet you know more about this yourself, but the main thing I would say about it is the law that creates the Société du Grand Paris, which is the implementing agency for Grand Paris Express, quite a lot of which has now been built, and next year some of the first lines will actually open. I'm sure you know that, which is incredible if you have been associated with Paris as I have for, 30 years or something like that. So, the first thing I would say is the metro system, of course, is largely the city of Paris, and the extensions to the metro system, which have gone to Saint-Denis and so on, are in many cases pretty recent. So the incorporation of the majority of the population into the mobility is entirely incomplete. I'm sure you know that. And all you have to do is to try to travel westwards on RER-A, on the Réseau Express Régional, under the city of Paris, early in the morning, traveling westwards from the eastern side of Paris, where most of the working class people live, to the west side of Paris, either to the city or to La Défense or to other areas where business and government and so on are predominantly located, and employment is asymmetrically concentrated. You try to travel on the RER-A and you will discover what overcrowding is like without the management in São Paulo, which is better than the management of overcrowding, than the management in Paris. So there are real issues which to some extent the new system of Grand Paris Express is supposed to address. So that sounds good for the working class people, if you want to think of it. But what about questions of gentrification and change? And of course, the Société du Grand Paris has the power to take over physical land use planning within a distance of 800 meters from every one of the 60 new stations, train stations, on the new network. In other words, the mairie, the mayor of the commune, loses authority in the banlieue of Paris to decide what the land use will be. Now, what did Baron Haussmann do in the 1860 kind of period, apart from extending the boundaries of the city of Paris? We were talking about that. Well, of course, what was the point of the boulevards? It was to recreate space for profit-making activities in the city of Paris, which included, if you like, a 19th century gentrification. And in a sense, what's happening with Grand Paris Express is beyond Haussmannization of the banlieue of Paris, because it's creating, and that's why it's a right-wing project in a sense, it's creating space for capital accumulation. You don't have to read David Harvey to understand Paris in that way, but it might be useful to read David Harvey. Drink a bottle of red wine with him, I discovered many years ago. That's the way to have a conversation with Professor Harvey. Drink a bottle of not what I gave you, a bottle of red wine, and you will see. So to me, and of course that will drive the gentrification of the banlieue. And the banlieue, of course, are very far from homogeneous. I mean, the mistake that most people in my language of English writing about Paris make is they treat the banlieue as though they're some sort of homogeneous, deprived, blah, blah. Please. The real world is much more complicated than that. So last, I've touched a little, I hope, on all your valuable comments. But the last point is the one that you raised yourself, Fernanda, which is to say, there's a long way to respond to what you raised. There's a long way to go in thinking through how we present this. Goes back to what Benny was saying, actually, how we think through the relationships between these different concepts and how we overcome, I would also add, the slippages between our languages and enrich our understanding in all these languages that we use to think about these matters. Fernanda, you raised the question of, to me it's also a slippage, the question of power and the region. So there's a lot more that we could be debating. And again, let me end these far too long remarks, for which I again apologize. But let me conclude these remarks by saying there's a lot of scope for people who are less than half my advanced age to be doing very innovative work. We are in such an exciting world. Yes, it's full of crises and wars and killing and disasters and floods and all kinds of difficulties, but it is nevertheless an exciting world of a lot of change. And the opportunity for people to be contributing in exactly the sorts of questions that you've been raising seems to me to be enormous, and we can continue to talk about that. So thank you very much.
Tem mais uma questão?
Yes, but I'll shut up. You don't. I'll shut up.
Just a last question, Professor Mabin. Again, thank you so much for the great lecture and also your great answers to the questions. I think the theory of extensive urbanization is key to think about contemporary urbanization processes. And I've been majorly involved in research along this. And what I was thinking about when you were presenting is how the extensive urbanization materializes in space beyond the infrastructure in all these five capitals. Because here in Brazil, there's been a lot of discussion about the typologies that appeared or have developed along with extensive urbanization, particularly when we look at this urbanization process through the lens of how capitalism rearranges as a system to profit with the extensive urbanization. So here in Brazil, a key typology are the gated communities. And I was wondering what types of typologies appeared in these five regions that relate to either more democratic, which I doubt, but might be possible, or more segregative typologies of occupation. And one last question is, looking at some of the graphics you showed, it's amazing how Asian cities, Delhi and Beijing, are completely intense and violent in terms of demographics, while the other cities go more. And here in Brazil, I was mentioning here with Leandro that the last census was really impressive for all of us in terms of how our demographics are changing, slowing down, and changing like amazingly for just 10 years, or a little bit more because of Bolsonaro trying not to do the census. But anyway. So how did you cope with that difference? Because it's really intense demographics, or if it was an issue during the process. Thank you so much for handling another question.
I thought that maybe the historians would complain that I had been, putting history down. Maybe other complaints. I haven't yet heard those. That's very valuable. First of all, my name is Alan. It's not Professor. I'm not a professor, really. I'm an emeritus professor, whatever that means. It means I have a life sentence. Actually, in South Africa, the retirement age is usually 65. And I'm quite a bit more than 65 years old, as it happens. So, yes, in theory, I'm unemployed. You can think of it that way, if you like. I want to ask you a favor. Can I take a picture of you all? Is that allowed? Thank you. I'd like to do that because I do have friends, amazingly enough. I have friends who might like to see. You know, they are very critical of me. They might say, but nobody came to listen to you. Why would they do that? Boring old white man, what are you talking about? You know, so I want to be able to be arrogant. No, I mean, this question of population growth is obviously, you know, at one stage in my life, I thought I was going to be a demographer, actually. That's why I went to Ohio State University. You haven't heard about that part of my life. That's when I ran away from the army in South Africa. Actually, it's the one place that offered me money. So that made it possible for me to leave the country, which was 50 years ago this year, actually. And then I moved to Canada, which you've heard about. But I gave up demography, and I actually got more into history, as it happens, than into other things. This question of what's happening in populations is very interesting because there's a commonality between Brazil and South Africa. I mean, there are many commonalities between Brazil and South Africa, although it's very easy to exaggerate them. You know, like Guilherme has written this really important set of texts comparing, for example, Soweto in the Johannesburg case and Selandia. And this relates to another point, which is, you know, which arises from what you're saying. How is segregation reproduced? And there's no question that segregation, we no longer have legal apartheid in South Africa, but there is no question that segregation is reproduced in new ways. And that is happening within the context of this commonality with Brazil, that the population growth of South Africa is dramatically slowing down. Now, it may be that the delayed census of 2021, which took place in 2022, it may be that there are big problems in that census and that it didn't actually count all the people. Maybe that's true in Brazil as well. I don't know, but probably not in Brazil. But so the census surprised a lot of people in South Africa by suggesting that the population growth rate of Johannesburg has slowed down dramatically. Now, that may exaggerate. I can tell you that in Cape Town, I was not counted in the 2022 census. But that's just me. I'm one little person over here, so I can't judge the census on that basis. I'm pretty sure that it's a commonality. And so what does that mean? Well, it's different from many other parts, not just Asia, where anyway population growth rates, especially in China, let alone Japan or South Korea, where population growth rates have dramatically slowed down, so that the population is even shrinking in some wealthy Asian countries. And it's probably slowing down in other cases, including the People's Republic of China, which has a complicated history, obviously. One-child policy, blah, blah, blah. African countries, this is actually where the greatest population growth is taking place, it seems, in the world. Not so much South Africa or Algeria at the different ends of the continent, but in between, most of Africa, in other words. Let's take the example of Dar es Salaam, which is a wonderful city to visit. You don't even have to speak Kiswahili, but I promise it would help, especially if you take a dala to move around the city. It's useful to be able to speak to people. It is predicted that within less than a generation, within maybe 15 years, Dar es Salaam will be the center of one of the biggest city regions in the world. In the world. because of the massive rate of population growth in that part of Africa. Now, I'm not judging that. I'm saying it is predicted, not by me. But it's dramatic because it relates to all of these concepts, these histories and these contemporary situations that we're talking about. And within that context, these other social and geographical processes of the reproduction of segregation are going on. So I stop there, but it raises once again new kinds of questions. They're not absolutely new. The same concepts existed in Buenos Aires in the 19th century, and in Paris and London and New York, and in Moscow and in all kinds of other, I've just been in Poland, in Gdansk, or in Warsaw, or whatever the case may be. And all sorts of strange events may change that course, which appears to be set. Wars, in particular, can change that course of change. Revolutions, I suppose you could say. But in other words, it comes back to that sense of uncertainty. And within that sense of uncertainty and the hidden nature of change, the opportunities, I conclude by saying once again, are enormous for significant both empirical and conceptual work. And that's why the kind of work which a labo like Capitais is conducting, and others around the world. That's why, for me, they are such significant exercises, and that's why it's such a privilege to be able to engage with colleagues here. Thanks very much. I'll take my picture.